All ready.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of All the Good Straight Puns Were Taken. With me, as hopefully always and forever, are Anna Isaac and Sam Lowe, the author of the Most Favoured Nation Substack, which is now coming out every week. Welcome back to the show, guys. How are you guys doing?
Bit chilly.
I would dearly love some chili in Geneva, although that we are melting.
We were melting last week and now it's just gone absolutely grot again.
Sam, how are you surviving the pressure of putting out a Substack every week? Have you run out of things to say yet?
Not yet. Things keep happening at the moment. I think I've picked a very easy period. You know, we keep signing new trade agreements, then signing them again, then finding out a bit more about them, then signing them again. It's great. But no, I'm well. I'm solo tonight, which is why I get to sit in the good room. But also means that if the baby starts crying, you'll either hear that throughout the show, or I'll go and soothe her. It depends how I feel.
Both of those would be an excellent sort of capstone for what it is we do here. One of the hosts just walking off. So ordinarily I introduce this show as a show that talks about the news, and we certainly do try to talk about what's new and what's going on in the news. But we also try to evolve with every show as we blunder our way through trying to deliver you guys some good trade content. And what we discovered is that what you guys seem to like is where we really unpack an issue and really do spend an hour kind of calmly discussing it without racing through 5 different things. So in that spirit, this week we want out the Australia Free Trade Agreement without quite talking about the Australia Free Trade Agreement, or rather talk about the huge issues that the debate on the Australia Free Trade Agreement kind of touched on. And Anna, since I think this was your idea and your baby, might throw it over to you and doing this week.
Yeah, so we've heard a lot in the news about people being very cross that welfare standards, other aspects of what goes into making a product, if imported based on a different regulatory model in the UK or a different belief in how animals should be treated in the UK, might mean that there isn't a level playing field. So the example that's been used recently are sort of Australian farmers versus UK farmers. So I thought it'd be useful to talk a little bit about product production methods versus the content. So rather than just what's in a good, the physical good, once it gets in and across a border, versus how it's made and what goes into that, because they have to be treated quite differently in trade. I thought one example that people were bringing up a lot when they talked about welfare with Australia was something called mulesing. And it's how lambs that grow merino wool, which is a massive export for Australia, have some skin removed to try and combat a particular fly that likes to attack its skin. Now, what's interesting about what emerged in this discussion about Australia and farming and welfare and imports is that you've had merino fleeces coming into the UK for a very long time, despite there being concerns over this practice. So I thought it might be helpful for people to understand what is straightforward to put into a free trade agreement in terms of product production methods or content, and what isn't so straightforward. And that's basically why I thought it'd be useful to have this discussion.
I think that sets us up really nicely. I think more broadly, there's always been a push for how do we make sure that what is ending up in our stores is ethically sourced from, not just from an animal welfare perspective, like what we were just discussing, but from a labor perspective, from an environmental sustainability perspective. And we spent the entirety of an episode discussing the European Union trying to, just from a climate perspective, rebalance things a little bit in like a subset of sectors, and that took us an hour, and the EU has taken like years to develop it. Sam, I know you've been thinking about these issues for quite some time. What are kind of some of your thoughts there?
I think it's a tricky one, isn't it? In that, in the public debate, there is no differentiation insofar as when we discuss trade agreements between what in a product, so say that is it safe or not, and how was that product created? As in, people will interchangeably jump between the two different issues and call for the same sort of. I tend to talk about this in terms of conditionality. So if you want preferential access or access at all to our market, you have to meet our rules. And people will jump between things that relate to food safety and also to do with how that food is produced. But in trade terms, those are two very, very different things. And this is, and Anna's just run through it, so I'm repeating it slightly. But when it comes to food safety or the condition of the food when it is placed on, say, the UK market, it has to meet UK food safety rules. There's not really any ambiguity there. To be sold in the UK, on the UK market, it has to meet the same rules as domestically produced food. Fine. There's some caveats there if we get to sort of pesticide residue levels and the like, but that's pretty much it. But when you talk about production of food, it's much more tricky, isn't it? Because the actual product at the end might be exactly the same. So they will meet all of the conditions to safely be placed on the UK market, but being produced in a completely different way. And people have very, very strong opinions when it comes to how things are produced. So if we think about animals, so are you allowed to beat them or not when you're producing them? Most people would say no in public, but some in private might be more in for it if it allows for greater productivity or scales or economies of scale or the like. But you can't test that at the border, and this is where it gets tricky. It's very difficult to just differentiate on this basis, particularly if we're talking about WTO perspective, which we'll get onto. However, and I'll stop there so we can sort of move the conversation along a bit. This conditionality around production methods has started to seep its way into trade agreements, and it started to seep its way into how countries think about it. And there's different views on this, and I'm sure we'll discuss it. You can either view this as protectionism. Countries are trying to make it harder for goods to access their market by putting more conditions on how those products were produced. Or you view it as I kind of do, a sort of necessary evil, which is that in order to liberalise beyond the point we are now, you have to bring populations along with you. And perhaps this is a key towards unlocking more market liberalisation in certain contexts. For example, the EU, where you can say to people, look, we're going to have to offer them more on agriculture, but in return, they're going to give us a commitment on X, Y, and Z.
So I guess to kind of put some of that together a little bit and talk about what I'm hoping to do with this episode. What I'm hoping to do in the next sort of 15 minutes is obviously to highlight the complexity, as we always do, because the one thing you can count on the three of us to do is to look into the camera with a pained expression and say, it's just so hard. And we will definitely do that, because we really can't help ourselves. But if there are sort of people watching who are passionate about these issues, and who are increasingly kind of focused on trade, the conversation is, for better or worse, increasingly focused on trade. As Sam says, these issues are creeping into trade, and trade is creeping into everything. Then I want to kind of go through what's the toolkit available? What are the different kinds of measures? What should you be pushing the government to do? And what are the likely consequences? And maybe kind of before we go there, I want to make a crucial distinction right from the start. I think Sam alluded to this. There's a question of what do you want your policy to do? And I think Anna brought this up as well. Are you hoping to ban a practice as aberrant? In the sense that there is some way that that a foreign government is allowing the treatment of animals or the environment or even workers, that you say flat out, this should not be in my market. Nothing produced this way should be able to make money off me and people like me. That is kind of tier one. And then tier two is saying there should be no advantage for producing like this. I want to use the policies of government to say that if you want to, I can't stop you from behaving in this way, and I don't want to ban your produce, but I'm sure as heck not going to let you use that process to cut costs. And it should be said that a lot of these practices are fundamentally a trade-off between something and efficiency. I think that's fair, Sam and Anna. There's probably a way that you could deal with the insect that mulesing is supposed to counteract more expensively, but in a different way. Or, for example, mandating anesthesia for sheep, as Victoria does for mulesing, is an option. It's just an expensive one, because you need one dose of anesthetic per sheep, and some of these herds are 10,000 strong. So these kind of things, just important to keep at the back of your mind. But I thought where we'd start is actually just throw it back maybe to Sam to talk through, first of all, kind of what I would consider slightly easy mode in all of this, which is when you are doing a free trade agreement, or when countries have done free trade agreements, what are some of the ways they've incorporated this kind of thing?
Yeah, so these would be, I think, what you refer to as the tier 2 or the level 2 type approaches. This is not when you necessarily want to restrict or ban a certain production method being used on goods that enter your market. So it's not saying, for example, that if you have battery caged hens, we're not going to allow any of the eggs to be sold on our market. It's just putting some conditions on preferential access to your market, by which I mean tariff reductions. And this is something that has been explored by a few different countries in different contexts. So one example that gets used quite frequently because it's most recent is with EU Mercosur, where for shelled eggs from Mercosur group, which is Brazil, Argentina, and a few others, to qualify for a tariff rate quota, the EU has opened up for them under the agreement, which isn't yet in force. They have to be able to demonstrate that those eggs were produced to EU welfare standards. So this is a conditional TRQ. It's one of those things that, to put it bluntly, if you can get the other country to sign up to it into a free trade agreement, you can start putting in this level of conditionality, because they will look at it and say, well, we do get a benefit from that. Another example of this, which is even more recent, is with Switzerland and Indonesia, where the EFTA bloc have a trade agreement with Indonesia, but it was becoming controversial in Switzerland. It was threatening the implementation because people were worried about palm oil and the impact of palm oil, which is actually quite extensive. It goes off in different directions. You get sort of environmental concerns, then you get human rights concerns, and the like. I can go into that. I've visited a couple of plantations, and it gets quite tricky quickly. But the way the Swiss dealt with this is that they made, again, a tariff rate quota for Indonesian palm oil, which would have offered a preferential rate to the Swiss market, conditional in this event on the importers being able to demonstrate that the palm oil met some certain private standards. So it was certified by, I think they picked 4 certification schemes in the end. Has this pleased everyone? No, but it pleased enough Swiss to allow it to pass a referendum to allow for the agreement to come into place. And then there's lots of other examples. I'll end with the big one, but one other one I found quite interesting, but this never actually came to fruition, is in the TPP. So this was the TPP when the US was still a member. In its trade aspects with Vietnam as part of that, it negotiated a side letter that made some tariff reductions conditional on Vietnam implementing certain ILO standards. And if Vietnam failed to have implemented them within a period of years, then the tariff reductions would either be suspended or they'd revert to where they were in the first place. So that was some quite interesting conditionality. And then the big one, which I feel has opened Pandora's box on what is possible, is the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which has a huge amount of conditionality in there. If you think about environment and labour and non-regression, so both parties committing to uphold existing levels of protection and precise levels and rule of protection and rules in some instances. And then also if you pull it over to subsidies, it's not dynamic alignment, but it sort of has the same effect. And these are conditions of tariff-free access. So my feeling is that we're going to see much more of this. And the rumour is the UK did propose it in the Australian negotiations. It certainly proposed it with New Zealand, making tariff-free access for food conditional on upholding certain standards, but decided to go against it, perhaps, as some suspect, due to the need for expediency for political purposes. But yes, we're going to see a lot more of this, and people either hate it, love it, or ambiguous, or a bit ambivalent towards it. But either way, it's something we need to work out.
So one thing, Anna, that Sam mentioned there was private standards and I guess internationally agreed standards. I know you've done some thinking about this, to what extent they can serve as a framework. Do you want to maybe talk us through some of that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. I think annoyingly, I'm going to start with sort of a domestic example, which is if you, a domestic government, don't want companies to make money out of something that you find in that abhorrent category in their supply chain, you can legislate to require certain standards of corporate governance. And this is something that you see little pieces of in the TCA, and will be really interesting to see how they evolve, particularly with modern slavery and the conversations that are happening now about alleged human rights abuses in the Xinjiang region of China, and how people want to try and handle that and stop, Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, said he wants to stop companies profiting from anything that's produced in those regions as a result of forced labor. But that's going to require a greater level of transparency and enforcement in the Modern Slavery Act than we've so far seen. And at an EU-UK level, they're talking quietly between governments, particularly France and the UK, about how they build on that domestic legislation. And that sort of starts from the basis of the same principle domestically as you come to with international agreements, which is actually trade is more effective at encouraging the behavior you want to see, rather than necessarily stopping the behavior you don't like or the activities you don't like. And so you can do that with domestic legislation. We have it with the Modern Slavery Act, but you also have it with other agreements, for instance, the Agreement on Climate Change and Trade Sustainability, that we keep expecting, Sam and I, the announcement to come any day now, that the UK is going to sign up to this. But this is an example of where you try and you try and bake particular standards into the way you conduct trade at a broader level. So there's a bunch of signatories, including New Zealand and Norway. It's still in negotiation phase, hasn't been implemented. But this upholds the idea that you as a trading nation avoid subsidizing fossil fuels, for example. You avoid other behaviors like tariffs on environmental goods, which the UK has recently scrapped just around Christmas time.
With a caveat, because the reason the UK is not signing up to it, I've heard, is that we've decided that we actually want to keep tariffs on 23 of them.
I thought we'd liberated them on 104, but...
Yeah, but there's some more that we haven't.
Okay.
There's the APEC shares left.
And we've suddenly decided we want to keep that 2% tariff on whatever to negotiate with the Americans.
Interesting.
Anyway, sorry, that was an aside.
No, it's an important aside. That's interesting. So that...
I was about to log off and write the article.
Try and stand it up, otherwise not based on Sam's weird thoughts.
I mean, it'll be there in the tariff schedules after a point, so I think we're good. But yeah, no. So that's interesting, and I didn't know that, and I'm very cross with myself for not knowing that. But moving on to keep the conversation going, so you have agreements like that, but also when it comes to things like trading and wildlife, it's not right to just say that there's nothing out there that tries to aim for better welfare standards or try and police trade in animals and wildlife. You've got the convention. I'm read this out because otherwise I get my acronyms wrong. It's called CITES, but it's the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And the idea here is to try and stop the trade of animals where you're trading them to extinction. So again, it has to be quite an extreme situation, I think, to see this level of granularity in terms of international cooperation on a broad scale. But that is an example of where people have come together and they've agreed it. So you have... Like we've said several tiers, you have the corporate governance structures you can put in place with your domestic legislation. You have your bilateral agreements, you have your trade bloc agreements, and then you have things that come to the WTO as a forum. And the WTO as a forum, as we've discussed or hinted at, is quite different in how they handle things like this, because that's about a much, much bigger group of countries than it is, and it's about grander principles than it is about a few countries getting together and saying, like, we don't love this behavior, let's try and encourage more positive behavior instead.
Do you want a fun CITES fact?
Go on.
It's one of the few. It's one of the reasons. It's responsible for one of the few instances in which you still need an exit summary declaration, or at least an approximation of, from Northern Ireland to the rest of Great Britain. Otherwise, it's one of the few times you have to do it, and you can't just get away with like the ship's manifest or something. Fun CITES fact for you.
That is a fun fact.
The trade in endangered animals even leads to bureaucracy between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. which was the thing that's mostly been removed.
I mean, I don't know how any of our audiences would be able to move on having that factoid, but to circle back to I guess what Sam was talking about before, actually really both of you, a lot of what you are describing is, as you said, the carrot approach, in the sense that a country has a WTO set of tariffs that it applies on everybody, and either as part of a free trade agreement or as part of a preferential agreement like the GSP2 Plus, the GSP Plus program, where the European Union offers a range of developing countries better access to its market in exchange for signing up to a whole bunch of conventions on sort of good governance and democracy and what have you. You basically say, I will open further for you, subject to certain conditionalities.
Yeah,
exactly. But obviously, there's an obvious limit to what you can do there.
And this is easy mode, isn't it?
This is absolutely easy mode, because firstly, the trade rules don't get in your way. In a free trade agreement, you can condition access to your market, improved access to your market, on basically anything you want. You can do insane things that you'd never get away with at the WTO, which is kind of like lower tariffs, but only for blue cars.
Yeah, only if you do backflips. Only if the producers do backflips every 10th car.
Exactly. Like the export declaration has to be about that. Like, you can do that, and nobody can stop you, because it's a free trade agreement. You're improving access for one party, and if they agree to it, then that's between the two of you.
Yeah.
But
we get into the hard stuff.
We are getting to the hard stuff, because if you look at where, for example, first of all, if you look at where the tariffs of a lot of developed countries are, they're not in that many places. Mm-hmm. The US simply does not have that many tariffs. And neither, for that matter, really does the EU or the United Kingdom. They have them in some... Yeah. So, if the country doesn't happen to produce long-grain rice, which is apparently the most powerful lobby...
Big rice!
Big rice.
Big rice. We should get this show sponsored by Big Rice.
Surely we're too small fry for them. Like, they're going to be sponsoring the Super Bowl if they've got the power to be the only tariff left.
They've got their hands in many pots, let me tell you. Many packets.
Still, we'll try to curry favor. Don't pity me, Anna.
Just horrendous.
Yeah, so you can leverage where you do still have tariffs. You can extend it, and you can leverage where you are a big destination market. For example, a lot of Western governments, frankly, found they had very little leverage over Myanmar after the coup. Mm-hmm. Because, so you sanction them. Like, most of their economy is trade in their immediate region, and frankly with China, which doesn't appear to be sanctioning them for the military coup.
Sorry, I actually have a rice example. Sorry, Cambodia, right? So the EU has rescinded some of its preferential access for rice, ostensibly because Cambodia is backsliding on its governance commitments. Also because they wanted to cheer up Italian producers because big rice. But yes, exactly what you're saying. But I'm not sure how effective it's been. The point I make, it's not changed. It's not solved Cambodia's governance problems overnight. Let's put it that way.
So that means if your toolkit within sort of free trade agreements and preferential trade agreements is thus limited by kind of your tariff ammo, but you still deeply care about these things, you've got to look elsewhere. You've got to think outside of that box. Does anyone want to start with sort of ideas and places you could look?
Reimpose all of the tariffs to give yourself more leverage.
Somewhere at Cato Trade and Daniel Hannon's think tank, somebody just clutched their heart. just great disturbance in the force.
I sense protectionism.
But I mean,
no, I'm joking. You shouldn't do that, but you could.
What else could you do, Sam?
You could ban things, Dmitry. You could say, I'm banning everything made using this production method.
Okay. So basically what you would be saying is that on ethical grounds, something that is fundamentally safe when it arrives in my country is still banned. Yeah. Even though it's safe to consume, but the way that it has been made is so aberrant to me that we're just not letting it in.
Yeah, so to give a completely random example, just off the top of my head, what if I were to ban the import of certain tuna product because the people catching it had been using nets that killed dolphins?
So my understanding is you would get in trouble because the case that you are alluding to was about labeling, and it was about denying a dolphin-safe label to tuna caught in this way, and that led to a whole WTO dispute. But I think it illustrates the point.
The second version of the case,
yeah,
the first
version
was just doing it, yeah.
Yeah. But I think generally the kind of, if I may, the overarching WTO principle here is that, with exceptions, you are supposed to judge a product entering your market on what it is, not how it was made. That is the kind of the core WTO rule. If the actual tuna in a can is like dangerous to your dolphins, then to your dolphin mind, then you can ban it. But if it is dangerous to dolphins but if the production method was dangerous to dolphins, then by the letter of the rules, you're not supposed to be able to ban it. But there are exceptions for basically good regulatory reasons and morality, both of which have been tested at the WTO. Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, I should say a big thank you here to Nicola Lamp, a professor of trade law who spent hours last night explaining this to me, who did not really get it and still doesn't. Any mistakes in this speech are entirely mine, and not Professor Lamp's, who's very, very good. But there are clearly there are, on the one hand, there are options. On the other hand, there are some pretty clear limitations around how you design these measures, right?
Yeah.
But that is an option you can pursue. What about Anna? Do you wanna talk us through private standards a little bit? Things like the Kimberley process.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can have industries that determine they want to behave in a particular way, and they can get together, and that's what you often see with a lot of international fora. Is it's rather than seeing it as like nation state to nation state, you've got to see it as private companies having set standards, and they're just like, look, we between us decide that we want something like a level playing field, which is to say that we don't think things should fall below this standard. The Kimberley process, which is related to diamonds, is about ensuring that people aren't dealing with diamonds, and diamonds have a very complicated history. They're involved in a lot of conflicts. They also have very clear differentiation in terms of purity standards, and the Kimberley process is about making it clear what origin a diamond has, and also kind of what levels it meets in terms of international production. And that's often when you see private efforts being most effective, by the way, is when they combine commercial interest with ethical interest. That's when they're often sort of rapidly adopted by particular industries. So yeah, that's one example of how it can work in practice. You also see, interestingly, companies can just make a decision if they're lent on by a government or if they're encouraged by a government. And this often happens, and it's quite hard to chicken and egg working out how did something become an industry standard. But for instance, turning back to Xinjiang, which is obviously a major cotton producer, companies have got together, but also various cotton-related bodies have got together, and they said, and they will often be sort of standardization. So these bodies will speak to all of the different global alternative bodies of theirs. And with cotton, they've said, we think that Xinjiang, which generates a phenomenal amount of the world's overall cotton, because it's the cotton hub of China, we're not happy with the labor standards here. And therefore, we recommend that you don't use this. And this is an ethical standard that becomes part of a company's reputation. And it wants to adhere to that, because otherwise, people, as they become more and more aware of, particularly within the garment industry, we've seen a really massive move in the last decade towards people being more interested in where their clothes come from, how people are treated. Post Rana Plaza, which was a massive factory that collapsed, killing a lot of its workers who weren't kept in acceptable conditions. This awareness builds. Companies cannot afford the reputational damage, or they believe they can profit from being seen to do the right thing. And so we've seen that particularly with H&M and Xinjiang on cotton. So there are cotton processes to check where something comes from and to try and remove it from your supply chain, though it's challenging. Similarly, as we said, the Kimberley process. So there are a host of different processes here that have been established as industry standards. And as I say, for them to be effective, there's been many failed attempts here. I don't want to make it sound like this is an easy fix at all. But where things become accepted as being both revenue preserving, so managing your reputational risk, but also ethically sound, and potentially, if you're thinking long term about the trends in ethical consumption, they can be a win-win, even if they are immediately very expensive, because shifting your supply chains is incredibly costly for companies. And it's something that they're thinking about more and more and more, not just post-COVID, but as things become very much clearer. So labour standards, shifts in labour standards are now being studied really, really closely because of the Modern Slavery Act. There was a report out from the University of Sheffield on Monday that was looking at how forced labour had become more prevalent because of the pandemic and its pressure on pricing in the market. People are realising that the reputational risk is just so great because people are asking this question and the scrutiny is there. So it's a combination of scrutiny, revenue, ethics altogether that makes those kind of interventions effective.
It's fair to say, isn't it, that at least among sort of activist type groups or campaigning groups, there's a fair degree of skepticism around private labelling schemes. So to use one I know, a sort of area I know a bit better. So if you think about palm oil, so referenced earlier, Switzerland making a certain tariff rate quota conditional on third-party certification by some of these essentially private schemes that are funded by palm oil producers, right? And the reason there's sometimes some of this skepticism is, say, a lot of environmental campaigners would just want to ban palm oil, right? So they effectively would say, well, no matter what you stick on it, you still have the problem that there's been deforestation, there's probably in some circumstances been draining of peat bogs. At some point, people were displaced, and you probably killed some orangutans, right? And they say, we don't think palm oil is something we should be using in our food. And sort of a third-party certification body that says, well, this palm oil has been produced relatively sustainable compared to, you know, some of the outlaws out there, which it certainly would have been, just isn't going to satisfy them. And I think navigating that gets quite tricky, because if we think about palm oil in particular, this is also, so if you think of another recent regulation in this case, so think about the EU's Renewable Energy Directive, which as part of that provides some subsidy to renewable energy, and renewable energy is defined in lots of different ways, but some of it would be biofuels, and they've decided to exclude palm oil from that equation. This is now leading to a WTO case, right? Because they're saying this is discrimination on an unfair basis. You have Malaysia bringing the case, you have Indonesia bringing the case. So it's complicated, and I think, you know, the sort of private standard route is one that certainly has been useful. It's certainly led to an improvement in how companies go about their business, but it's still left a lot of people unsatisfied, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is the scrutiny level that requires a degree of government oversight in order to be effective. So things like with the Kimberley process, if you want a very weird factoid that I came across once, which is that George Best Airport for a while was the designated entry point for rough diamonds into the UK, which felt like a beautiful metaphor for life itself. This notion that because obviously it's easy when it's something small that's incredibly valuable. I say easy, it makes it very easy to smuggle, but it's easy per unit to see the value of the checks and the administration. With something like the Kimberley process, it's a, you know, and the huge exposure, the column inches that got written about conflict diamonds that led to this multilateral action. That was an easy win-win for government and business, and government wanted a degree of oversight of it because it worked from an organised crime perspective in their own interests. What's way harder, but is getting much more exposure now because of people's interest in oceans and fishing and sustainability, is things to do with trawler behaviors, illegal fishing, management of fishing areas. And I think that that's something that becomes much harder, because if you look at the per unit value, in the same way that if you look at the per unit value of things like palm oil, the economic interests of both business and government are sometimes very skewed in different directions. And that's why these private standards can be so much more difficult to enforce. And line caught tuna labeling and the impact on marine life being a very good example of this, because line caught in one place means something wildly different to line caught in another place. The baiting methods can be different depending on how you look into it. So it's definitely true that these labeling methods and these processes for verification are often really ineffective, as Sam says, but there are some rare examples where the two things coincide, often where people feel like it's an easy way to address criminality, in the same way that excise duties are used by governments as a way to sort of keep a handle on organized crime in many ways.
So, in terms of one person's line could just be a normal fishing line, and the other one has electricity running through
it. Electric shock fishing is a big thing. That's real.
And dynamite fishing.
And dynamite fishing, yeah. So just to kind of circle back on both standards and I think labeling, if you think about what it takes to work, and I think, Anna, you talked through a lot of these issues. First of all, there's a retailer element to it, right? Which is that it tends to work really well when retailers or kind of end chain producers decide that they want to be associated with a private standard, or, as you said, conversely, they don't want to risk what it means not to be associated with a private standard. So that kind of works. When does that tend to happen? I think, as you alluded to with conflict diamonds, it tends to be issues that get a lot of press. It tends to be fairly, I don't want to say uncomplicated, because of course they're complicated, but fairly clear right and wrong morality tales where there is a behavior that is obviously wrong. It helps when it concerns a luxury item like diamonds or, say, merino wool for Paulo Genia suits, rather than a food staple. Because whenever you start talking about, food staple, you start getting into there's a morality argument to be made for, we need to feed some people. So it works there. I think in terms of labeling, especially things like Red Tractor and other sort of sustainable farming labels, Heart Smart labels and things, they work very, very well at the consumer-facing end, but perhaps leave something to be desired on the B2B end. Does anybody check their frozen pizza for a Red Tractor logo when they're buying a frozen pizza? This is the kind of debate where it starts to fall short. The further away you get from people and scrutiny, I think there's some limitations there. And then finally, as you said, it's not enough to just have it. You've got to really think through how you're going to keep it from becoming captured by the people it regulates, effectively. Because if you have an organization that is supposed to certify, whose wages are being paid by the producers of the thing, there is constantly going to be a temptation to be accommodating. Year after year, morality, all it takes is one slip and things go down. But it's still a potential option, and one with some kind of interest.
I mean, at the sort of more positive end of it, I suppose, you can argue there's lots of academic papers written on the effectiveness, but if you think about fair trade, you have the Fair Trade Foundation, which does have quite good provenance when it comes to its supply chain. You can say, well, this banana came from here and we've audited it, we've been there, we've made sure X, Y, and Z is happening. And you have sort of, you can get into deep development theory about how effective that is as a tool of pulling people out of poverty, but you can at least know that your banana was probably produced in a relatively kindly way.
And I guess it's possible that as kind of technology gets more and more powerful, and as technology gets more and more powerful, and kind of the hunger for this kind of information grows, we'll get more supply chain traceability at our fingertips.
Yeah,
right?
Blockchain's going to be really big. And
Yes.
I'm joking.
Unironically, yes.
This is one of the few areas where you actually do see blockchain being used as a quasi solution for something, and it's the provenance of products and supply chain traceability. And you have some big companies that have signed up to, certain companies providing a solution. You still do have the quintessential blockchain problem, which is garbage in, garbage out, in that it is fine that everything on that chain is authentic and immutable and cannot be changed. But if the information that has been placed on there is incorrect or a lie, you still have the same problem. So it does strike me as a useful blockchain that could potentially be done using other approaches anyway, but it doesn't remove the need for essentially effective oversight throughout the entire process. But yes, this is one area where blockchain is still arguably a slightly unnecessary solution, but is at least providing a service.
There's some weird conditionality, and I'm not going to name a couple of companies I've spoken to, but there is some weird conditionality that can be applied to it that is interesting and is theoretical at this stage, but it's a bit like, as we see in a lot of supply chains, and it's more complicated than some of the green seal reporting made it look, but invoice financing can be an interesting way to manage your supply chain, or beyond just payment on receipt of goods, but payment on the nature and the scope of how goods arrive. And if you apply certain conditionality to different stages of, like Sam says, but just the way you manage the inputs into the blockchain in terms of ensuring that payments are stage gated based on different levels of conditionality, that's where it can get quite interesting if what you want is to see all the way down the ladder. Mm-hmm. And to, in a way, like safeguard your, as ever with these things, it's about risk management. That's how companies work. They want to manage their risk. They want to be able to show that they have done the right thing insofar as they are able the way down. And so the level of transparency it offers might be interesting. It's one area of trade where I'm a bit less dismissive of blockchain than I might be in a bunch of others.
My big experience with this was one time I bought a beer that said that it was on the blockchain, and I tweeted saying, "Why is my beer on the blockchain?" And within 30 seconds, the owner of the company that had put the beer on the blockchain was in my DMs telling me to be less skeptical. So if that's something worked.
I'm not sure it's a miracle to get blockchain bros to yell at you. I've been able to do that without the beer. Just really by existing online.
A markets reporter, let me assure you, that can that can happen fast and in volume.
When Ethereum makes you redundant, Anna, because we're all on the move, then we'll know. Okay, so we've got a little bit of time left, and I want to kind of bring us back to kind of hopefully some conclusions. So Sam, as someone who used to do a lot of activism, if you are an NGO in the United Kingdom, for example, and you are deeply concerned about, let's say, antibiotic resistance, right? Mm-hmm. And you want to engage with trade policy, what's your advice? What would be your advice now? We've laid out the toolkit. What do you think?
That's a good one. So antibiotic resistance is one in which there is actually quite a lot of global cooperation on this, and it's, for example, something the UK, at least in terms of its trade agreements, does make reference to. It says that it wants to use them to help deliver a reduction in antibiotic use. I suppose, so there's different routes you could take here. So, for example, if you had a government who was very accommodating and listened to you, you could ask them to make access to the UK's, preferential access to the UK's market conditional on a low usage of antibiotics in the herds that produce the food or whatever. You could, if you can convince the government to ban them domestically, if you can say, well, we're going to ban antibiotic use domestically, you could potentially impose that ban upon imports, in that you don't have a national treatment issue, but we do then hit up against some of the things we've discussed as to whether this is a production issue or it's something that impacts the end product. But it is possible to justify these bans and exclusions so long as you can do so on, basically so long as you're not engaged in arbitrary discrimination. You do have a really good public policy objective, so protecting human health, the environment, and the like. And antimicrobial resistance does feel like one that would have some, general buy-in. But more effectively, you'd probably want your government, if you're trying to deal with this globally, to sort of engage in some sort of international treaty where everyone agrees to it. And wouldn't that be nice? But it never really happens. But it does get tricky fast. Sorry, just before I hand over, because we haven't talked about it, but the hormone beef example is quite a fascinating one here, in that it is banned in the UK and EU at the moment on the basis of the hormones that we use to grow this beef being dangerous to humans in some way. However, the EU has lost that case at the WTO. It hasn't been able to successfully demonstrate that there is a threat to human health. So it is actually banning this illegally, as is the UK right now. But when you talk to campaigners about this, they say, well, we're not so worried about that maybe, but actually the use of all these hormones means that you get this big intensive farming that requires the use of more antibiotics. So you have production method issue that is sort of 2 steps removed. And in their heads, it is perfectly justifiable to ban the use of hormones on that basis. But actually, the ban that's in place doesn't refer to that at all. It's got nothing to do with it. So you do sometimes end up in these sort of complicated compromises where both worlds interact and then a compromise is formed. And yes, maybe the EU and the UK are technically in breach of the rules at the moment, but they've still got the ban. So yeah, it's fun and complicated, and I like it. I like talking about it. I don't like antibiotics running rife and threatening human existence. That I do not.
I think I take kind of two key points. I mean, the first one is, to what extent should activists care that what they are asking for is not, strictly speaking, within the vision of the drafters of the 1947 GATT? And there's an argument to be made in both directions there. On the one hand, you want what you want, and who cares? On the other hand, whenever you ask the government to do something that is directly contrary to their international obligations, or will potentially be a case, you obviously raise the cost of compliance with what you're asking for. You're giving them an easy out to push back on you, and you're also making it, frankly, harder, even if they're inclined to do so. The thing that you've asked for, if it's illegal, the price is high. The government makes it pay it.
There's a third bit of politics to this now, though, isn't there? Insofar as policymakers generally are now, those in favour of a rules-based international global trading system, are generally quite concerned about its vulnerability at the moment. And I would say there is now an innate fear that the WTO, for some reason or other, will be seen to come into conflict with an environmental objective. So say the fight to combat climate change, something existential, and that if it is seen to come into conflict with the fight to combat climate change, it is the WTO that will lose that discussion. And it could quickly see to the dissolution of the rules-based trading system, which means now when you talk to people, they might have been very adamant that none of this stuff had a place at the WTO before. It's not the right place. If you just don't discriminate, it'll be fine. Now people are much more cautious. You start hearing talk about climate waivers. You start hearing talk about, well, I don't like conditionality around production methods, but maybe that's something we're going to have to deal with if we want to keep this show on the road in general.
And I mean, the US is backing the TRIPS waiver. Like the waiver on vaccine patents, the US has backed it, which would have been unthinkable 5-10 years ago. So there's certainly this sense of like, there are issues, and sometimes the rules are going to be on the wrong public perception side of them. And in that point, maybe it's time for the rules are going to have to do some tactical retreating in order to preserve to preserve the army. There's going to have to be some retreats and some sacrifices. So I think that's an important point. But I think the other point that sort of, for me, jumped out from what you said, Sam, was in thinking about this issue, as with any trade issue, there are going to be winners and losers from anything you propose, and they're generally not that hard to work out. And, if we're talking about hormones and antimicrobial resistance, the winners from a ban are UK farmers that don't want to compete with these larger herds that are pumped full of antibiotics. So for activists, a natural spot is to constantly be looking for strange bedfellows. Mm-hmm. Because trade will weirdly, put you, suddenly you're shoulder to shoulder with Nestle on plastic pollution, and you're this is bizarre for me, but meanwhile Nestle is saying we want a global ban on certain kinds of plastic packaging, because then everybody would be on the same playing field as us, and we could ban it too. We can't ban it if everybody else can use it. And so kind of thinking about it in these weird alliances of trade forms is maybe a good piece of advice for activists to just think about.
There's a phrase for it. It was to do with, someone created it around the creation of the single market, I think. Maybe it was created before that, but it's the Baptist and the bootlegger. They sort of ended, they had the same objective, because
keeping prohibition, yeah.
Prohibition,
Anna, maybe to move off AMR. If you were thinking about approaching, let's take labor issues, for example. If you're deeply concerned about worker standards, even worker safety, you mentioned that horrible garment fire. What are some things activists should be thinking about if they care about these issues and they want to push them through processes?
I think they should be looking at the enforceability, and they already are, so I'm not going to try and patronize people that are already doing what they're doing, but I think when I'm speaking with them, what they're looking at is the enforceability, the teeth of domestic legislation in lots of instances, but also they're looking at the whole process of supply chain auditing, because the issues when it comes to labour standards, oftentimes the interest in having poor labour standards is to pay people less. It's not very complicated. It's quite simple in that regard. We've seen that with, for instance, with the pandemic, people in some countries have been, they've played a very hardball approach with payment because they say we need less of something. No one's walking into this shop and buying that garment. We need less of it. But rather than thinking all the way back down the supply chain effects of cancelling a particular contract, or maybe even being a bit sneaky about whether or not they need to pay it because that jurisdiction, by the way, won't have any clout when it comes to them facing legal action, is that all the way down it forces then this pressure towards the bottom, and that means that suddenly people that had relatively good governance in their workplaces, for instance, they would have, if they reported sexual harassment, they'd report it to someone and that person would likely be sacked. There's no one really overseeing that anymore. That governance process has fallen away. So I'd go for two ends of the spectrum. I'd go for obviously the reputational damage, and that's what we see often with the sort of the big showpieces, but also think about that reputational damage all the way down the supply chain auditing mechanisms and ask where are the weak links here that will cause either most reputational damage or display a business risk that company hasn't considered. So there have been really good examples of this, particularly in the energy industry, when you think about things like energy transition and solar panels, people saying okay, we want energy transition and we want, domestic companies to do well out of new climate change requirements. By the way, these solar panels are being made in Xinjiang. That's when you've had an example that Sam was almost pointing towards, where you've had a domestic industry that wants to be involved in a particularly, lucrative trend caused by government action, but at the same time, campaigners have been trying to draw attention to forced labor. But there are lots of ways in which I think the garment industry has been put in the spotlight in this way, and I don't think you would have had the same rapid response from some absolutely massive retailers saying we cannot afford to have that in our supply chain if it weren't for the work of campaigners going all the way down all of those links and saying, here's your reputational risk, here's your reputational risk, here's your business operating risk. I think that's been key.
So I think those are hopefully some vaguely usable pieces of advice and analysis. As I promised, this is all just so incredibly hard If there's one thing that the global production chains are good at, it is finding the path of, I won't say least resistance, but certainly greatest profitability. And at the end of the day, there are limits to what you can do sitting in London and making good choices at Waitrose, and even calling your MP to influence something like labour standards or what a farmer does to a cow outside of Western Australia.
And sorry, just to build on that very briefly, because we're coming to the end of the show. There's the market size question as well, because a lot of the time, your ability to influence beyond your own, the economic practices beyond your own borders is dependent on the attractiveness of your own market. So their desire to sell to you. And that means that, for example, the US has actually quite a big ability to influence beyond its own borders, because companies do want to sell there, and they will jump through hurdles to be able to continue doing so. If we think about the USMCA and the upgrade that Trump put in there, where he put in some minimum wage labour requirements for certain car production, Mexico just ended up signing up to it because you wanted to be able to, and actually they were paying that anyway, so it's fine. But so the US has a lot of power here. The EU has a lot of power here. Sort of the markets just below that. So I'm thinking Japan, the UK. Then below that, you've got sort of Canada, Australia, and the like. Markets, buy stuff, but companies aren't so dependent on them for the most part. I think have slightly more limited ability to influence those decisions. However, the consumers in those countries don't care for that argument, right? It's very difficult to say a campaigner in the UK, don't waste your time doing this. They don't sell that much to the UK anyway. You're never going to be able to change an entire global supply chain just by whining.
I think that I'd counter that with saying that this is where the private side of things has become more important because of the impact of things like social media, where you start to see that companies have to think about global reputational risk, irrespective of the jurisdiction, where someone's holding up their smartphone and filming something that looks very, very bad, because it can spread like wildfire very, very quickly. And if you're not seen to act rapidly, you're not shut out of the US because the US government doesn't like the government where something's happening. You're shut out of people's purses because they've said, we don't like that, and none of our mates like that, and none of their mates like that. And by the way, the person I follow on TikTok just did an absolute killer takedown.
This is where the UK, I think, does punch above its weight slightly. If you're still going off my previous argument in terms of economic size and market power. I mean, English language media, we have quite a large concentration of that, which allows reputations to be set. And then also, just because of the size of our financial services sector, companies do have to list here. And that does occasionally come with certain corporate accountability requirements. And I'm sure there'll be more of those introduced. And that's something we didn't really discuss, but we haven't really got time for that.
I think we'd have to do a whole different episode on money laundering.
Well, let's not do
Anna's guide to cleaning cash. I guess the final point in the UK's kind of not defense, but really the other thing countries like the UK, Canada, and New Zealand, what have you, are good at is multilateral and sort of small country diplomacy and building these coalitions in a way that the US and EU, for example, are simply often too cumbersome. And
don't need to be, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, they never need to, and they're not often very good at it. And they just wait until somebody else builds it, and then they come in, and by signing up, they effectively get, signed on as co-chair. And by the time they clear their domestic processes, like, the thing is almost ready. So I think you can push the UK to show leadership in a lot of these forums, because they're agile and motivated enough to do it, and frankly have a pretty good civil service that's good at this sort of thing. So it's not all bad. And on that weirdly positive note for this show, we will wrap up. As always, I will show your to the moon links where you can invest in AMC and Bitcoin for Sam. So with me today is Anna Isaac, who's at Anna Isaac on Twitter, and Sam Lowe, who is at Samuel Mark Lowe, and is the author of the Substack Most Favored Nation. Twice a week, once every 2 weeks. Yeah, I want more. I've paid now. Once every 2 weeks or once every week if you are a paid subscriber, and I do recommend that you become one. So everyone, thank you so much again for joining us. Wasn't quite as newsy as our other episode, but we hope you still found it useful. And we'll see you guys in 2 weeks, unless I come up with a zany bonus episode idea. Thanks so much, guys, and thanks, Sam and Anna.
Bye-bye.